Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Thanks for listening to the podcast. My guest today is someone who was a major force in my own graduate education and is a major force in the field of American history. His name is Professor Joshua B. Freeman, and I'm still getting used to calling him Josh. But we had a great conversation about him growing up in New York City and what his work is in the field of history. Professor Freeman was the chair of the history department when I first applied to the CUNY Graduate Center in 2004. I was applying to the CUNY Graduate Center from Southern California. I had no idea how I was going to move to New York, how I was going to pursue this education. I really had very little idea what the form of the history Ph.D. program would take. But Professor Freeman was someone who communicated with me through email, through phone, and then eventually I visited his office in the winter of, 2004. And he convinced me in every way that the CUNY Graduate Center was the right place for me. And he ended up being an incredibly generous person in both an academic sense and in a personal sense. He's a great guy, and he's got a wonderful story to tell about American history and about his own life. I finally got to ask him, a little bit about where he comes from, what he was doing during the turbulent 1960s and 70s that I'm so interested in. And he has some great stories to tell. One of which, really surprised me that he was at the March on Washington. I think he actually surprised himself, remembering that he went to the March on Washington in 1963, and he's got kind of an interesting take on what happened there and what his own involvement in that was, and how Brooklyn in particular was connected to the civil rights movement. But he talks about the Vietnam anti-war movement, and he talks about his work in labor history, of which he's probably most well known for studying American labor. His books include In Transit, the Transport Workers Union in New York City, Working Class New York, Life and Labor Since World War II, and a book that I've been using to teach some of my survey classes called American Empire, 1945 to 2000, The Rise of a Global Power, the Democratic Revolution at Home. That book, his latest one, American Empire, is an awesome synthesis of the last 60 or so years of American history. It really puts together a lot of different kind of social, political, and cultural stuff in a way that I think is really powerful and profound. His chapter on Reagan is, for me, one of the final words on what the Reagan quote-unquote revolution did to the United States. So we talk a little bit about that book, and we talk a little bit about where we are as a country now politically, and particularly what the state of American labor is. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Joshua Freeman, and tune into more Nostalgia Trap episodes on iTunes, on Stitcher Radio. Find the Facebook page, and I'm very excited to be featured as part of Jacobin Magazine. You can go to jacobinmag.com, and there'll be a few episodes featured over there over the coming weeks. So again, I hope you're having a great summer and enjoy this conversation with me and Professor Joshua Freeman.
So I grew up, my parents were New Yorkers. My father worked for a while for the Army Signal Corps in Philadelphia. So I was actually born in Philadelphia because although my parents were New Yorkers, they lived down there for a while. And then they moved back here when I was about 5. And I when I was young, we lived in a garden apartment way out in the eastern part of Queens. Mm-hmm. And then after a while, they bought a single-family home, and that's kind of where I lived when I went to junior high school and high school out in Queens. And my parents were extraordinarily old, still live in the same house after all these years.
They weren't extraordinarily old back then.
No, they were not extraordinarily old back then, although they seemed much older than me back then.
Yeah.
But no.
Well, that's that generation gap. Do you consider yourself, like, where are you in relation to that baby boom generation? Like, where do you place yourself? I'm not talking about like dates necessarily, but in terms of kind of the kind of generational thing that happened in the middle of the century.
Well, when you actually live through these things, you don't actually think, you're just living your life. So, I think living at that time, one didn't really think about it. I guess in retrospect, I certainly was part of it. I mean, in one literal sense, I was sort of part of it. There were like 1 million kids. So we lived in this garden apartment. And can
you just describe what a garden apartment is?
I'm sorry,
for those
sure.
that don't know what that is.
Garden apartment, they're not just in New York, but they were very common, kind of in the 50s and 60s. And these were usually 2-story rental buildings. They would have apartments. And they were often organized around courtyards. So you'd have like 3 of them that would define like a U, and then there'd be either parking behind them but they'd be kind of grass courtyards. Many of them in New York City, I'm not sure if this was true elsewhere, were actually nonprofit cooperatives. But some of them were just, commercial projects.
Yeah.
And they were put up, in great numbers after World War II, and it was a place where a lot of young families moved, after the war, late 40s, early 50s. And of course, they're still around. In many cases in the New York area, they've been sold off now as, individual units, although some of them are still co-ops, actually. And, interestingly enough, for those people who've ever read The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan actually was living in one of these places.
Oh, wow.
Out in Queens in the period that she kind of is retrospectively writing about when she wrote that book.
It seems like, and I don't know if this is a broad statement that could be completely off base, but it seems like housing might have been easier to get for some people, or just cheaper. I don't know, adjusting for inflation. Housing is a big problem in New York right now. And it seems like working class families had an ability to get houses near the city, or is that?
Well, yes and no. When the war ended, there was a much worse housing crisis than today. There just wasn't enough space, and no housing was built during the war. No housing was built during
the birth of the suburbs, then.
Right, and nothing was born in the Depression. Right, so that's in Levittown and a lot. And in these areas, like where I grew up, they were still kind of fringe. There was a lot of undeveloped land, even though they were politically within the city of New York proper. A lot of them had been golf courses, some of them even farms, amazingly enough. So, for a while it was extraordinarily difficult to get housing. Then I think eventually, these kinds of possibilities opened up, either the small Levittown type house or the garden apartment. And a lot of people moved there, sometimes kind of reluctantly, because what was very difficult to get was, a family-size apartment, in a more central part of, let's say, Brooklyn or Manhattan. So, but there were like 1 million young families. So these courtyards, were just completely full of kids. You know what I mean? And you just stumble out of the house and
get involved in stickball.
Yeah, you'd be there all day, and at the end of the day someone would scream, until it's time to come in for dinner. And if you were lucky and it was the summer when the days were long, after dinner you'd stumble right back out again. So it was, in that way it's kind of great.
I mean I live in Sunset Park now, and during this I don't know which I prefer, because during the springtime and summertime all the kids come out, and it's like a very family, the street is a very family, or it's like Sesame Street. And so that scene that you're describing of kids playing outside, it's kind of hard to write my dissertation sometimes when I'm sitting there and the kids are playing outside, and it's hard to be nostalgic about that. So I guess a big part of who you are is that you eventually become a historian concerned with labor, and it seems like that's connected to your parents a little bit in terms of the working class identification.
Yes and no. My parents were children of working class families, but they were upwardly mobile. They were professionals. My mother was a social worker. She eventually taught social work. My father was a kind of self-taught engineer. He was what was called a packaging engineer. So he sort of picked the kinds of equipment you needed to do, these are consumer product packaging, design, the shipping things, work with designers. So, it was a thoroughly middle class
Did they
family.
ride the train to go work in the city?
No, actually. My mother worked in in various places, but in the Queens and Nassau County area. And my father used to drive to work, and he worked in Jersey for a while, and then he later worked for Helena Rubinstein, a cosmetic company, which actually had a factory out in Long Island, and he would work a few days a week at the factory, and then a couple days a week he would take the train into the city for their corporate headquarters, which were actually in Manhattan.
What was your cognizance or consciousness around unions? When did that develop? Was it something that would have been discussed in your house at all, or something that came later?
It wasn't discussed in my house, but it was not a big presence. My grandfather was a very active unionist his entire life. He was a furrier. He was he was a cutter, which is a very skilled job, and he was active in the union from its founding virtually. And when I was growing up, he was still working. He kind of worked. He was very skilled, so he could always get work whenever he kind of wanted. And he would work 6-8 months a year, and still active in the union. So the union was a thing. You sort of knew about it. But it wasn't that big a presence, and the kind of neighborhood I grew up in, which I think is thoroughly middle class in a lot of ways, and yet it was much more mixed than this first look. There were kids I went to high school with. Their fathers were taxi drivers, they were blue collar workers. It was actually quite varied. So it was kind of part of the world I grew up in, and then there were when I was in high school, there was a big transit strike in 1966. So, but it wasn't a big thing. And this was not the trajectory as a young person. I was like a science math kid.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. And
is that where you imagined yourself as you were going forward?
To the extent that I did such a thing as imagining the future, which I'm not so sure. I did that much. Yeah, it certainly would have been that. Yeah.
So were you like the straight A student that was a scholar from the beginning, or did school something that didn't appeal to you for a while?
No, I did okay in school. I'm not sure I was like the straight A student, but I did well in school. I was very good in science and math, and I was involved. One of the great experiences. I think they still may have at Columbia University used to run this thing called the Science Honors Program. It was for kids very good in science in high school.
Yeah.
And you'd go on Saturday to Columbia and take classes. And the test to get into it was the hardest test I ever took in my life.
I'm sure.
To this day. And and the kids were all incredibly smart. But then the cool thing was you spent every Saturday, you spend the morning at Columbia and take his classes, and then you'd hang around the city. So it was kind of great. So and I was a science major actually in college. Also, I was not a history major.
So when does the switch take place for you? How does that happen for you?
Well, I was interested in history a little bit, mostly non-U.S. history, but I was very politically active, and in the anti-war movement, other kinds of things in college, even in high school. Actually, I was quite involved in civil rights stuff. This was, of course, the height of the civil rights movement.
Is that what drew you in at first to political activity? Is the civil rights movement? It seems like that's a very kind of standard story, maybe even a cliche about Northerners during the 1950s and mid 60s. Is like getting involved in the civil rights movement as the initial kind of baptism into politics.
It probably was in a way. I had an older sister. She was 2.5 years older than me, which of course when you're 13 or 15 is a huge difference. And she was kind of politically active. What was interesting is it was not just the civil rights movement. She was involved in the anti-nuclear testing thing, which is a big thing in the early 60s. And in fact, there's a very famous demonstration which she went to. She was still in high school, so we were like both living at home, where students picketed the White House. It was in the middle of the winter, demanding a nuclear arms treaty, and John Kennedy, was president, sent out urns of hot coffee to.
I remember Todd Gitlin telling this story.
Yes, this is a very famous thing. I'm sure Todd was there, and my sister went. She was probably like 15 or 16. So I was kind of aware of that. I
think the young people and like Dr. Spock was involved in that anti-nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big thing. Of course, there's an adult version of it. There was Sane. There was a big late 50s, early 60s was a big issue. Yeah. And there were other issues. For example, the first political act I think I ever did was SDS. Yeah. Now, this is before the Vietnam War, organized a boycott of Chase Bank because of its investments in South Africa.
Isn't that interesting?
And I happened to have my, $13 life savings in the local branch of, the Chase Manhattan Bank, which in high moral, outrage, I withdrew because of this is after the Sharpeville massacre, civil rights, of course, became a huge thing, but it wasn't as if it was the only thing. There was I guess you'd call it a new left or these other things that were kind of floating around and kind of reached the level of.
Again, it's one of those things that you've like written about and other historians have written about, but like you said, it's different when you're living through it. You don't like have a kind of a sense that you're living through some set kind of phenomenon that's going to be described described like this later. So when you say civil rights movement, what did that mean to you at that moment? Was it specifically like aimed at the South, or was it kind of like about larger issues?
I think it was mostly aimed at the South. I mean, this was the very dramatic stuff was going on in the South. So, for example, I was a member of something called SCORE, which was Student Corps. And it was the youth branch of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. And there was I went to a very big public high school. And there was I don't think it was just our high school. It might have been like our area of Queens, or maybe a couple high schools. And and we'd meet once, I don't know, every 6 weeks or something, and then we got involved in raising money for the Freedom Summer in 1964, and subsequent stuff. So it was pretty oriented towards the Southern thing. I actually went to the March on Washington.
Oh, right, the 1963 one. You were there for that.
I was in yeah. Sometimes I look at these pictures and I'm startled to think,
it seems
my God, I was actually there.
I was alive.
Yeah, I was alive. Yeah. I was like 14. My mother, my parents had been leftists, but they were not activists. When I was growing up, they in their young years they were very left, and their political outlook was still of that general orientation, but they were not actually politically active. So I was not like a red diaper baby. And
did they talk about how did that?
Yeah, absolutely. They talked about politics.
Like dinner table conversation is going to be about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was actually very untypical of my parents that my mother took a day off from work, and my sister and I and my mother all went down to the March on Washington.
It's amazing because I sometimes wonder about in hindsight, how big was that? How big was that before? Did people know this was going to be a big event? And it sounds like you did. I mean, it sounds like a family.
Someone
family
did.
that's generally left but not necessarily active decides to pack up on the bus and head down to Washington D.C. That seems like people would have known something was going on there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I was 14, so it's a little hard to reconstruct it, but I think that's actually right. And, of course, incredibly dramatic events that happened, Birmingham and so forth, just preceding it. So, there was lots of reasons to think this was terribly important. But it was quite an experience. We went on a bus, probably sponsored by the local NAACP. I can't really remember who sponsored, but it was really a mixed bag. I remember my sister and some of her friends who were at least high school things, and then there were some adults like my mother, and then there were a number of black church women from the local Baptist church. And there we all were on this bus together, heading down to Washington. It was kind of incredible. It was kind of incredible.
Can you speak a little bit about because the part of that story of that kind of connection? I think someone recently, I don't know if they were in this department, wrote a dissertation here about the Brooklyn chapter of CORE. And it seems like there's a high degree of like Jewish participation in it. Was that something that you were aware of during this time or not?
I don't think as a kid I was that aware of it. With the particular little micro neighborhood I lived in was not particularly Jewish, although there were some Jewish families, and a lot of my friends were Jewish, but it was not a completely Jewish world by any means. In fact, the elementary school it was mostly Catholic and Protestant. I'm sure that's true, but I don't think I thought of it or was aware of it at the time. In retrospect, I'm sure it was true. I'm sure if you looked at the whites, because it was certainly not all white, our student
That's what I was kind of imagining, is what this bus looked like.
I'm not sure. I think probably the white high school kids are mostly Jewish. But there are these black Baptists, and there's a lot of other people, too.
It's a fascinating kind of moment.
It was.
Okay, so that's 1963, and you're 14.
Oh, yeah.
And so, how does that
get to history.
Activism progressed.
Well, I think so I was active in college, doing all the standard things, anti-war stuff, and I was in SDS and so forth. And I was never like a huge leader of these things. I was just like kind of a rank and file participant.
But you felt it was important.
Oh yeah, it was very central to my life.
Yeah.
Very central to my life. Part of the reason I think I sort of drifted away from doing science was because I think I was grown up enough to understand that kind of science I was interested in, which involved a lot of lab work, required a kind of discipline and a concentration and a prioritization that I understood I wasn't capable of, at 20 or 21, for lots of reasons. The world was kind of flying apart, and politics and drugs and this and that, and I was not willing to give the attention that I did understand that would require. So I kind of drifted away from that, and I was very, very politically active.
Yeah.
But I also pretty quickly realized that these movements were peaking out, and I kind of started thinking about the issue of quiescence, actually, and then I started sort of thinking back, and by then I had a fair amount of political contact with labor unions, because in New England there were a fair number of unions that were against the war in Vietnam, and they were the exception, but they weren't a tiny exception, and they were very fascinating and admirable people that I met who did that, and I read enough history to realize that when I was born in 1949, and there was this utterly a massive labor movement that seems full of sort of all kinds of potential, and I thought by the time I actually was like a college student, that movement seemed to have kind of become incorporated or something, I got really interested in that question, how
what do you mean by like become incorporated?
It became domesticated. It became, it did good things. It represented the interest of its members. It promoted good, but it didn't represent an opening, or at least I didn't think it represented, I might have been wrong, an opening towards a fundamental reconception of the social relations.
And is that something that you desired at that moment as a young person, a fundamental reorganization?
Oh, sure, yeah. I was a college kid in the 1960s. Everyone did.
Okay, so you're thinking there, some sort of revolutionary situation is happening, perhaps.
Well,
and not necessarily. Let's not use the word revolution. Yeah. Let's use, there's changes in the air.
Yeah, I think the
unions for you were not a part of that.
Well, the most not part of it
in their incarnation in the 60s.
Yeah, I think it was more the moment, which I think I came to pretty early, leaving that moment of thinking this is a revolutionary moment. That I began really thinking about these things. I thought, what is the sources of stability for the society? How did this seemingly raucous, set of social movements of the 30s and 40s kind of become so much less, full of these sweeping possibilities. I mean, a lot of these premises, in retrospect, were not 100% true. But so I think I got kind of interested in that, and I like to read books, and I sort of thought, that's what these historians do. They lie on the couch and they read books. That seems good.
That's what I kind of wanted to understand is how where you find all this information, and you're drawing pretty advanced or sophisticated conclusions about what unions are up to this time. And unions, from our perspective today, unions, aren't really discussed in a lot of detail in the mainstream in terms of. So where are you finding this kind of?
Well, you've got to remember, this is still a moment when the union movement is much bigger. One thing, for example, is today the strike, the big disruptive strike, is basically not part of our society. It's gone. But that was not true in the 1960s. Lots of strikes. So, for example, in 1970, there's this national GM strike. It's a big thing. There's a big GE strike, which a lot of students have got involved in supporting. In fact, John Sayles, the filmmaker, wrote a novel about, it's called Union Dues. And it's exactly the events I was kind of involved in. It was up in Boston, and, there's kind of the students getting involved in supporting these unions. So it was, you didn't have to, go digging, under the carpet to find these things. They were just there, in a way they're not today.
It's something I don't often think about in terms of the student left or the young left during that era is supporting unions. Unions, you tend to see their fight as their fight. Is that something that has happened a lot in American labor history? Is it kind of like the outside people that aren't involved in the fight coming in to support the union?
Sure, although it's episodic. So actually a lot of that in the 30s. And there was some of that in the 60s. I mean, more than I think people realized. Now, a lot of these things were kind of regional. I don't think anyone's ever really written about this in any systematic way. New England had a particular kind of labor movement that I think was a little bit more open to this. There were also residues of these old left unions, like the UE, United Electrical Workers, was still a kind of factor up there, or people who had come through UE. And some of them were in fairly responsible positions. So it was not the broad labor movement, but it wasn't a tiny margin either. These were groups that had some substance that were open to this, and I think there was also an early realization among a lot of student leaders. I mean, people who I took my cues from, not from myself. That students were a pretty limited constituency for a broad social change, and you had to build kind of alliances. So, it did. There was a fair amount of it. I mean, I think probably my little grouplet, was not typical, but we weren't that exceptional either in looking fairly early on to seeing how we could build those relationships.
Well, I think of I guess I don't really think about the 1960s. I mean, maybe it's ironic about that we don't think of the 60s as a radical moment for labor, considering there's a radicalism happening everywhere else. But there was the YSA, where the Young Socialist Alliance were, and even I think the SWP were kind of interested in getting young people to start working in factories and start joining the working class and organizing from within. So I guess that is part of that.
And of course there's a lot of that just slightly later. Some of these kind of Maoist groups in the early 70s, a lot of them do that. And a lot of those people actually did, and some of them eventually emerged as kind of pretty big-time labor leaders. If you think, there was a big dispute just a couple of years ago that involved Andy Stern, who was the head of the SEIU, John Wilhelm, who was the head of the hotel workers, and Bruce Rayner, who was head of the Unite, the garment workers, and they were in this complicated battle with one another. And all of them had gotten into the labor movement through the student movement. Wilhelm was from SDS at Yale. So there actually was more of that than I think many people realize. It wasn't as if the labor movement was particularly radical in its demands. It was very militant, and those are somewhat different. So if you look at strike incidents,
what's the difference between radical and militant?
Well, I think of militancy as a kind of a measure of how tactically aggressive you might be, how insistent you might be, what you're willing to do to achieve your ends. But those ends may be very conventional. We want higher pay, or we want
militant tactics towards not necessarily radical ends.
Exactly. And of course a lot of the AFL history is that, and often the highest degree of militance may be about very conventional demands. I mean, back in the progressive era, when there was a whole systematic campaign of bombing at construction sites. It was run by these conservative Irish Catholic iron workers who had very traditional union demands. It was kind of ironic because people associated with bombs with kind of anarchists. But actually, the most systematic campaign was by the most conservative wing of the labor movement.
Or taking on the tactics of Emma Goldman.
I don't think they needed Emma Goldman to teach them how to blow things up. They were construction workers. They knew how to do it all on their own.
When you say that, I think of I don't know how much you're aware of the 15 Now movement that's happening right now around wages, and in Seattle they have an open socialist on the city council who's promoting this idea, and it seems like that $15 an hour isn't necessarily a radical, position to take. Although it's been taken that way, obviously, by the powers that be. But $15 an hour isn't particularly radical. But they're willing to take a more militant stance to get to that point. It seems like that movement is interesting to me.
I think that's right. So I think back in the 60s there was just a high level of strikes, and some of them, of course, were on not traditional issues. The New York City teachers' strike, which was very disruptive, and was really about the issue of who would control schools, not about pay. So sometimes they were, but more typically they were about wages and working conditions. But there was a lot of militants. I think there's a lot of mutual influence through the other movements. The notion that disruptive activities can actually win things, you know.
Well, the right learns a little from that too. You know, the right seems to pull those tactics. I mean, when we look at the Tea Party now, they kind of organize. They have picket signs. You know, they're using the kind of grassroots tactics of the left from the 60s and 70s to get their points across.
Yeah, in fact, I think you saw it much earlier in the anti-abortion movement, which explicitly adopted a model of the civil rights movement, nonviolent civil disobedience at first, although many of them became quite violent later on. A kind of moralization of politics, very, and even claiming the mantle sometimes of Martin Luther King or other people like that, speaking truth to power, putting our body on the line, all those kinds of, were appropriated by the anti-abortion movement. So I think it's actually not even a recent thing. It's been going on for a quarter century now.
Yeah, actually, Corey Robin has a piece up right now about Clarence Thomas using the kind of language of Black Power throughout his career. It's very important to him. He's not a Black Power person at all. That's not his politics, but the kind of language that he uses kind of co-ops that a little bit.
Yeah, although of course, I spent a year in Worcester, Massachusetts. This is a long story, but I spent 1971 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and of course, Clarence Thomas went to Holy Cross, and so I got to know all these Holy Cross student activists. Clarence Thomas was quite active in the Black Student Union at Holy Cross.
These are things that I'm just finding out now.
Yes, and so and that was quite a radical group. Of course, that was in the. Like many young Black activists, they lived in the shadow of the Black Panthers. They were acutely aware of that. Doesn't mean they endorsed everything. I don't want to say that Clarence Thomas was a Black Panther or anything like that. But it was a militant example of a Black student union or a Black student organization. He was quite a central figure in that during that period of time.
So how did you eventually conceive of history as an extension of what you were going through during that era? Because you say you began to be interested in labor in particular,
right?
So how does that translate to deciding to study it in graduate school?
Well, life is funny. You stumble around. I was living in New York. I was back in New York, and I thought this might be something to do. I was kind of interested. I frankly didn't know quite else what I would do. I was just looking around.
Like where I was in the spring of 2004.
Exactly.
Figure out what to do.
And I again, I don't want to overemphasize how politically active I was, but it certainly was pretty central. And I had a sense of this movement that I'd been involved in was imploding. And so I it seemed to me a bad bet to just keep doing the same thing. So there was a little, it wasn't little, it was an MA program at City College. In history. What the heck? I might
give it a shot.
Yeah. Little did I really understand that it was this particular moment. So, of course, Eric Foner was teaching in this program. Herbert Gutman was teaching in this program. It was actually quite an extraordinary constellation.
Yeah, wow.
Of people that were there.
Those are big names.
And many other, wonderful.
And you didn't know that beforehand? You kind of like...
Not really, no.
Yeah, I mean, no. I'll admit, it was the same way. I mean, I dropped into classes my first semester with you and James Oakes, and I was kind of figuring out who these people were, and I no offense, I just was, delighted to eventually figure out that I was going to school with some really important, cool people that had really important influence in the discipline. So what were your years at City College like?
I was just there for 1 year as a part-time student, and then I realized I wanted to do this. And so I decided I didn't even finish the MA. I decided to apply to a Ph.D. program. So I did that. So and so after 1 year there, I transferred to Rutgers and did a PhD there.
Who were the people that you worked with at Rutgers?
Well, it was funny because I went there to study. They had a program in comparative labor history.
Okay.
And that's what I thought I was going there to study. But actually, before I even got there, it kind of fell apart because the key European person in that was Peter Stearns. And he left just before I got there. So I ended up just doing a U.S. history degree. And there was, who was then a young historian, Danny Walkowitz, did U.S. history there. But David Oshinsky, who become a very prominent political historian, was there, and I worked a lot with him. And a guy named Norman Markowitz was there. And then, it was quite Lloyd Gardner, Warren Sussman. They had quite a impressive faculty. I got to say, I was not immersed in the graduate school experience. I lived in New York. I commuted. I had a part-time job. I had lived...
Do you remember what your part-time job was while you were doing this?
Yes. So this was the residue of my science, math background. So I had self-taught myself computer programming. This is still, punch cards.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of this was kind of... SPSS, statistical stuff, and I got kind of hooked up somehow or another up at Columbia doing work for sociologists. So I did some of that and other kinds of research works for various sociologists at Columbia. I worked for Amitai Etzioni, who was quite a prominent sociologist for a while. And but more and more, I just started doing this computer programming stuff on the side.
I didn't realize you had a tech background.
Yeah. And you punch out these cards, and then you put them in the machine, and 3 days later you get the results. And if you made one mistake, you have to recycle the whole thing. It was not as much fun as it is today.
Yeah, my dad is a telecommunications engineer, and his work on that started with punch card technology. And I mean, it's a different world. What has evolved since then. I mean, a lot of that stuff came out of the Vietnam War, actually. The military kind of figuring out how to do that stuff. Okay, so what did you write your dissertation about at Rutgers?
So I wrote my dissertation on the Transport Workers Union in New York City, and it was directed at this question I had been interested in all along, which is kind of what was the trajectory of these unions that arise, seemingly very radical in the 30s, and kind of what happens.
Yeah,
and I was very interested in the political dimension, both the internal, but also their involvement in electoral politics and so forth. So I was kind of looking around for some union. I thought to do a case study, and this was just when people like Herb Gutman were having a lot of influence, mostly in 19th century labor history, in converting this into a kind of social history of the working class.
Yeah,
and I think, like quite a few other people, there's nothing unique about me. I started thinking, well, how does this apply to the 20th century, and how could you connect this to issues of traditional institutional history? And so I think I was kind of drifting towards the idea: could you find a way to sort of understand the social history of a group of workers and see if, in what ways, the institutions that arose to represent them reflected the cultural, the social, nature of that particular workforce.
Yeah.
So I was sort of looking around for that, and I had a summer job. While I was in grad school, Nelson Lichtenstein just graduated from grad school. He'd written a dissertation. He couldn't get a job, and he was editing this thing called Facts on File that was doing these volumes on presidential administrations that were like little biographical dictionaries. And he was hiring grad students, right?
Yeah.
And you're supposed to send in some essay. So I send in some essay about something about the CIO or something.
Right.
There's something about the auto workers, I think, to this guy I never heard of, to try to get the summer job, And Lichtenstein calls me, come here immediately, right? Of course, all you want to do is talk about the UAW, right? So it was a match made in heaven. I ended up working there, and there was this journalist who was there, an old-time journalist, a real kind of Irish journalist, Irish-American journalist type. And we got kind of friendly, and he started telling me, he says, "So you got to meet my dad. He worked for the subway system." He starts telling me all about his dad, and he's this Irish Catholic, but it was a communist union, and it was like, boom, the light bulb went off. And it was very funny because I actually did eventually meet his dad, who was completely inarticulate, and as a source turned out to be completely useless. But it didn't matter because I was on to it. So that's why I ended up.
So what was it about that particular thing that he said there, that it was Irish Catholic and communist?
Well, exactly. Yeah. How's that? What's that about? How can that be? And this kind of rich world of Irish republicanism. I first started getting this kind of glimpse of it, and of course I remembered the tremendous 1966 transit strike. And Mike Quill, who was the embodiment of this combination or contradiction, however you want to think of it, between the left and kind of traditional Irish Catholic and Republican politics, all kind of mixed up together. And it seemed fascinating,
Yeah.
and I probably had residual boyhood sort of fascination with subways. I think every boy who grows up in New York, is obsessed with the subways.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing, it was just like boom.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did, and it took a long time, but
Okay, can you explain for those of us that are confused by this about the subway? It's public transportation. It's owned by a company called the MTA. Is that right?
Well, it's a complicated history. So every city is different. It's not, but in New York City, the subways, as opposed to the trolleys, were built through a kind of, today I guess we call it public-private partnership. So that they were owned by the city, and the city paid for the cost of digging the basic infrastructure.
Okay.
But they were operated under leases to private companies who really were in the driver's seat. I mean, the city was basically the financer. So there were private companies that ran these.
Okay.
And there were two big ones in New York. And then in 1940, and this is a long, complicated story, the city took them over and merged them with the small city-run line, and that created the modern New York City subway system under public ownership. From a labor point of view, this has a very interesting implication, because it meant at the heyday of the CIO, these were privately run companies. So it was really like a private sector unionization drive, very similar in that sense to the auto workers or the steel workers. Then, not long afterwards, they become public employees in an era in which public sector unionism barely existed and had no legal basis. It was generally considered, even by liberals, even by the New York City mayor at the time, LaGuardia, a great liberal, even by President Roosevelt, as inappropriate to have private sector style unionism in the public sector. So this particular union I happen to study is both a story of a unionization of a private set of companies, and then the story of creating really a kind of precedent for a mass public sector union. So it turned out to be a very interesting case. I don't think I saw all of that when I ended up picking it. But so since 1940, the bulk of the system has been run. It's owned by. Well, it's complicated. So it was basically owned by the city, but it was originally run directly by the city, but then it get transferred over to a kind of state-city public agency, semi-independent, called the MTA, which is now what controls it.
So if MTA workers are then classified as public workers, that affects their ability to strike.
Yeah, well, public sector workers in the United States are not covered by federal labor law. So every state has its own laws, and in New York State, since basically the end of World War II, it's been illegal for public employees to strike.
Well, does that relate to the Patco strike? Is that the same kind of thing that happened?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Federal workers, again.
Because I think in your book, and I want to get to American Empire, because I want to talk a little bit about the rest of America. But you mentioned that Patco strike as and located as kind of the last or the end of an era of the disruptive.
Yeah, well, strike. I think it was part of that. Yeah, no, I mean, federal employees were always forbidden to strike, and it's kind of illegal.
What's the reasoning behind that? Why is it that?
Well, that's an interesting question. There are multiple arguments about this, and and these arguments began to be elaborated really primarily in the World War I era.
Okay.
When labor was very feisty.
Feisty's one way of putting it.
Yeah. One argument, which is what I call the sort of sovereignty argument, says that the employer of public employees is not like a company. The employer is a sort of sovereign government that represents the people. And therefore, because this is a democratic institution, at least in theory, that's running or owning these kinds of things, that a sort of strike against the public employees, in a sense, a strike against the people and the principle of the sovereignty of the people over the government and its associated arrangements. So that's certainly one kind of argument that's often made. I mean, other arguments are made too, which in some ways really would apply for the private sector too. These are vital public services, so they uniquely.
That's what I always thought. It's associated with transportation and air traffic control and these kinds of things.
Right, and of course there's some of that true too. Congress set up special labor procedures for the privately owned railroads in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Because they were uniquely disruptive of national life. So that's an argument. Of course, not all public employees are as central to the society as others,
Sure.
but some clearly. So that's an argument too. I think. More recently, other arguments get, efficiency arguments about, the general argument. I don't know if it's true, but a lot of conservatives argue that strong unions make for inefficient enterprises and strikes and other things like that. Strengthen unions, and if you want to have cheap and efficient government, this is the Scott Walker argument that was used in Wisconsin. He really made an argument about efficiency, and cost. It's not
Scott Walker's part of something that I talked about, with Corey Robin the other day about, the right seems to be focusing on labor more now than before. Is that true in terms of attacking?
Well, public sector labor, very much so. I think there are many reasons for that. One of it is the private sector is so weak already that if you want to sort of knock out the labor movement, you have to go after the public sector.
Yeah.
The other thing is some of it's partisan. A lot of these public employee unions are big funders of the Democratic Party. If you weaken them, you weaken the Democratic Party. So I think that's actually a lot of what is going on. Some of it's ideological. People just don't like unions. They don't like the notion of bringing democracy to the workplace, and they're kind of offended by it. And then, of course, there's the special case of public education, where this gets wrapped up with issues about charter schools. So there are multiple layers.
There's a lot going on, and it's a multi-pronged attack. It seems like
it is, but it is very much. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, and in a sense, you see the layering of almost every argument that was ever used against public sector unions now being put forth. But in the period I was looking at back, it was this sovereignty argument, I think, that was... And eventually you got a sort of formulation from a lot of people that said, okay, public employees could belong to unions, but they can't have exclusive representation, they can't have contracts, they can't strike. These can be kind of almost like lobbying organizations. So there was some concessions, and of course eventually that changed, and by the 60s and 70s in much of the country, although certainly not all of it, there were both legal and institutional changes that facilitated actual private sector style labor relations.
So going back to when you're writing your dissertation at Rutgers, and I guess this is the 1970s that this is happening.
Very late 70s and early 80s.
So it's like the Patco Strike would have been happening almost at the same time.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny. I don't think I really focused on it.
That's what I was wondering. Is kind of like, did you have any sense that you were writing about labor in the middle of a kind of decline, at least for a moment, in labor's kind of public influence?
Yes, of course I did. But I think what I didn't have, and my good friend Mike Kazin, I think in a review of my book, pointed this out. I don't think I thought enough about this public sector issue. I really primarily wrote this as a case study of the dynamics and trajectory and social basis of a CIO union. That was really my primary. And I don't think I thought... And of course, I did in great detail, unbelievable detail, the story of how the state took over the union and how the industry and how the union fought to maintain its bargaining rights. But I didn't really think more broadly about this in the context of public sector unionism. So, of course, I was extremely aware of the Patco Strike and so forth, but I don't think that probably influenced a lot of my thinking about my work, historical work at that moment. In retrospect, it was of more relevance than I thought of it at the time.
It seems like the Reagan years had it was kind of a cultural shift as well in terms of, and when I say culture, I mean like the culture of the right kind of came out as anti-labor in a more overt way during that era, and it maybe took a while to see that.
I guess so. I think people like Kim Phillips-Fein have argued that there was always a kind of anti-New Deal tradition among big sections of American business. I think a lot of historians have argued for many, many years that, much of business accepts unionism on a strictly pragmatic basis. It's not like they're ever really reconciled to this idea. And I think what happens in the Reagan era is that they see an opportunity to do things that they might have wanted to do all along. That's why Patco, in my view, is so important. It's actually, in my view, more important in the private sector than the public sector, because it sends this message: you can do what really had been the unthinkable, which was to maintain
workers.
operations and hire replacement workers in a multi-site, big national economic operation.
Yeah.
No one really was trying to do that. There were Phelps Dodge, a few little examples of it, but companies like Greyhound, were not, breaking strikes by hiring replacement workers, and I think the success of the Reagan administration effort to defeat the Patco strike, sort of opened people's eyes, like, wow, you can do this.
Yeah, and I think that's what I mean by culture. I maybe mean attitude. That what's important about the Patco strike was the attitude towards workers. The attitude towards the strike was that almost like, that it's not exactly that laws changed because of the Patco strike. It's that the attitude or position towards labor changed.
Absolutely. There's no significant legal change at all. Absolutely. And, it's coming from business, but it, reflects
taking the gloves off.
And a kind of feistiness. I associate it as much with Thatcher as with Reagan. A kind of new confidence, an iconoclasm. Reagan is an iconoclast. He's not traditionalist. And that spirit. Hey, we could do these things that seemed undoable. I think that informs a lot of things, including labor relations. From a management point of view in that era.
Have you heard that the phrase from Margaret Thatcher that she said there is no such thing as society?
Sure.
What are we supposed to take from that?
Well, they're only individuals. Well, look, this is all she's saying is the starting premise of modern economics. Neoclassical economics is entirely built on the idea of the economically rational individual. It
seems like the right is really good at making those kinds of pithy statements that just kind of perfectly capture their ideology. And I say that because I just read your chapter on the end of history, the Fukuyama thing, where he says there's no more perfect. I think we have reached the apex of human ideological evolution, and it's really this is it. This is as far as we come.
I think
as a species.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that some of it, particularly, I think you saw a lot of this in the 80s, and I think there is a kind of adventure. This is kind of almost fun, to take on these folks. And, the liberals are very defensive, and they've got things to defend, ideas, institutions,
We call that trolling on the internet. Kind of poking at and trying to get a reaction.
And of course, a lot of it is also, kind of in English context, but kind of there's an American version of it, a kind of upper class, kind of wise, feisty is the wrong word, really, but sniping at those below you, becomes acceptable, and you really see this in the emergence, for example, in student conservative movements like that Dartmouth Review. A lot of those people are very clever, actually. But they're very clever from a kind of privileged position, and they no longer feel inhibited about. By liberal orthodoxy, and there's something very liberating about that, I think. And in those moments of liberation, people get very witty and clever, whereas if you're just defending, this thing which half of you is questioning whether it really works anyway, it's hard to have that kind of expansive, freedom, creative way of putting things.
They're good at getting attention that way. There was a Times article this week about a kid at Princeton. I don't know if you saw it, that wrote a piece about white privilege. And he said it's impossible to be a white male at Princeton anymore, and I find that really hard to believe.
I do too.
But it seems like it's almost calculated to be come on. If I respond to that, I'm just taking the bait because it just seems impossible to actually think that.
Yes.
All right. So before we go here, I wanted to ask you about your book American Empire, because it seems like you went from a focus on New York City for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, what was it like to then blow that focus out nationally? I know that's kind of a big question, but how did you start looking into the rest of the country after spending your career kind of with a pretty narrow focus on the city? Which many people say, there's a famous introduction of Bob Dylan song. He says this song wasn't written in New York City; it was written in the United States.
Right.
So what was that like to kind of?
It's funny. What I literally did, and this goes back to childhood memory. I read about 2 years worth of National Geographic magazines from the mid and late 40s, because there was, this is like the perfect middle brow kind of, self-representation of the United States. They always would do these, state profiles. These articles on the Iowa State Fair, or the miracle of Missouri or something like that. So I read and there'd be one every month. So I read like 2 years of those articles because I just wanted to sort of put myself
immerse yourself
exactly
in middle America,
exactly.
middle American culture.
And I made a decision, in terms of the book structure, which in some ways was slightly perverse, which was to start with the Midwest, and start with the portrait of the Midwest. And you could argue that a north-south dichotomy or even east-west dichotomy might have been a more dynamic way of structuring it. And I did think about doing it, but I kind of deliberately wanted to do the Midwest, in part for the purpose of forcing myself out of my suppositions to try to think, how does this story look like if you're looking at it from the Midwest? And then also, of course, the Midwest had elements of every region of the country, within it, and therefore, so I did try to do that. So I read a lot of this kind of regionalist literature, and then guidebooks, some of which were very famous, John Gunther, political.
Yeah, you had us read that in the modern politics class I took with you several years ago. Now I realize we were doing research for you in that class.
No. I had done the research already, and you were benefiting from my wisdom.
Okay, I forgot.
It's a subtle distinction.
Forgive me.
I love that book.
Yeah, I love it too. And I mean, that whole opening section of your book that does all the kind of regional description of the United States in 1945 is super useful for a guy like me that kind of wants to, talk about 1945 as a kind of pivotal moment, at the end of the war when things really take off in terms of the late 20th century. And you describe it as not really a national unit in some respects.
Right.
That there's very different things going on in these regions.
Yeah, and of course I overemphasized that probably for purposes of highlighting the differences. The Civil War was long over. We were one country in a lot of ways, but I think that was certainly true. And I did want to, it's so funny because you see a movie set in 1946, the country doesn't look all that different. I kind of wanted to make the country look a little stranger, to modernize. I wanted to bring forth what was really very different, and many of those things were, of course, varied regionally, and it's easier to see in certain places which seem really different, like the parts of the South, for example. It was almost a necessity for myself. And in fact, one very smart historian colleague of mine said, get rid of it. After he read the manuscript, he said, just start. Yeah, you don't need it. Just start with the dynamics of the actual thing. That was a great exercise for yourself.
Yeah.
And I saw the wisdom of what he was saying. I really did go back and forth about whether to include it, and I got a lot of advice on that issue because I wasn't quite sure, and it was very mixed. And I decided to keep it in the end. For better or for worse, but
I would say,
that's what I did.
I would say for better in terms of my classes that that I teach at CUNY. When we're talking about 1945, I use that chapter just to get everyone on the same page, and I'll even put a map up, and we'll kind of what are the key words for each of these regions, and particularly economically, realizing that each region is kind of geared towards a particular kind of economic production, and that trickles into all the cultural stuff too.
And of course, I was mimiking a way of thinking about the United States that was so prevalent at that time.
Yeah.
That there are
the guidebook itself.
The guidebook itself. There's economic geography, which was a big. And you read these books, and they would go through each region of the country. And I remember even in school myself, you have these maps of the United States, and they have little symbols for what's produced in each state. Little pigs in Iowa, and big trees.
I love those.
Yeah, exactly.
The hinterlands of Minnesota.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it was a way in which America thought about itself in that era, much more than today, So in a way, I was kind of mimicking it, in starting the book that way,
Okay, so the class I'm teaching right now that uses your book is about the New Deal. The class is specifically about the New Deal and kind of tracing New Deal ideas and their evolution through all the way to today. And for for the final essay, I'm having them try to choose, and see if you can answer this question. What you think? I'm having them try to choose 10 consecutive years between 1945 and 2001 that you think are the most critical 10 years for changing New Deal ideas and changing, kind of assuming there's a decline,
right,
in their prominence. But if it were up to you, which 10 years would they be?
Well, that's an assumption that I don't think you could I can't completely agree with you on, because, a lot of the New Deal programs, which had this air of universality, really weren't universal.
Yeah.
And of course there were other things that the New Deal did not pay a lot of attention to, like formal political rights, which Roosevelt, was very careful to kind of stay away from linking the. And so, you could argue that there's the extension and universalization of the New Deal. That's one moment, which, you'd certainly locate in the 60s, primarily. And I think that's very, then
I think I'm meaning specific policies. When I say like the decline of New Deal as like kind of the approach of government. And particularly with regards to like public works programs and the kinds of programs that you saw that came out of the New Deal, particularly around getting people to work, the welfare state, those things have declined in American influence, right?
Well, yes, but I think I would argue much less than, I think the political impulse behind these things. But, if you actually look at the core legislation, except for aid to dependent children, what later became aid to, families of dependent children, really no core New Deal program has been repealed since World War II. I mean, a bunch of them were dropped during the war. But since then, these things have now, of course, they've been greatly weakened. The percentage of unemployed who actually collect unemployment is much lower than it used to be. The minimum wage has been terribly degraded by inflation. They've been hugely weakened. But, there's never been a massive rollback of the fund. Even in labor law, which is what I'm particularly concerned in. Taft-Hartley is clearly very pro-business and so forth, but doesn't undo the fundamental principles of federal labor law. And there's basically been no really huge change since the late 40s. The implementation, the practice, the practical meaning of these laws has changed. So it's sort of interesting how long the institutional and legal residue of those moments lasts.
Yeah, I mean,
and just one more point, and also some of the things people associate with the New Deal would drop pretty quickly, like massive public employment as a counter-cyclical measure.
It's the 46 election, and the Republicans watered down the Full Employment Act and all that stuff.
Yeah, and you have some of it actually in the late 70s with the CETA program, but you could argue that. Roosevelt's body was barely cold when a lot of these things, disappeared. So, I'm not so sure necessarily we should position that as a phenomenon of the 80s, 90s. It's the political impulse, the sort of mentality behind these things in some ways that's maybe changed more than the actual institutional.
I'm going to have to retool my question for my students.
You get a free pass. No final this year. I screwed up the question.
I should have known you would be this way, because in your chapter on Reagan, it's really interesting the position you take on Reagan, because on the one hand, I think a person that was a fan of Reagan would read your chapter and think you were completely unfair to him. You take a lot of shots at him for like his level of engagement, his level of intelligence. I mean, and I know this, I've taught your book a few times now, so I'm used to reading it. But anyway, your position on Reagan is kind of that ironically maybe he didn't really achieve the kind of attack on the government that he was representing to the public. So it seems like that what you just said about the New Deal, like not being in such decline, kind of goes along with your position on Reagan, right?
Right, sure. Ironically, it's Clinton, not Reagan, who actually reduces the number of civilian federal employees. Absolutely. I'm glad you liked that chapter, because I was very pleased with it. It was not a subject I thought much about till I started writing it, and I thought in the end, Reagan, he's a very fascinating character, and it's a fascinating political moment, and of course, it is extraordinarily important in changing how people think about government. But what actually happens with the government is a much more complicated story, and less the story I think some people think it actually is. And even what he himself thought about what changes to make is slightly, Reagan was really not particularly focused on rolling back the New Deal. He was really focused on rolling back the Great Society, if anything, more than the New Deal. He remains a kind of Roosevelt backer. I ended up finding myself thinking about other dimensions about Reagan that seemed to me most important. And I think I end the chapter by trying to argue that it was his kind of willful refusal to think about consequences. That was.
It's a really disturbing final paragraph.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. Well, I hate to say it, but I think that was kind of his legacy to America's political life. This kind of you see it in George W. Bush, I think, also this kind
of laid the groundwork for Bill Clinton to come in and use words like "I'm going to end welfare as we know it" and that kind of stuff.
And also just this kind of complete disconnect that where you could call, for example, constitutional amendments to balance budgets and then promote policies that create some of the biggest deficits in United States history. And you saw a similar thing under George W. Bush, where there were stated policy objectives and actual things that you do, and they have like no connection whatsoever. Well, I think you see a fair amount of that in the Obama administration.
Definitely, too. Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of like disconnect between the expectations and the kind of campaign rhetoric. I mean, with George W. Bush, he ran very powerfully, at least the first in 2000, on a very strong like evangelical Christian kind of constituency aimed at abortion, homosexuality, etc. And we didn't see like laws banning sodomy during that era. We didn't see him push through laws changing abortion, really. It seems like his constituents must have been disappointed in some respects.
Well, I think that was the brilliance of Reagan and some Bush, the ability to juggle that, because there are multiple conservative constituencies. There's a kind of libertarian component.
And some of the contradictions within
exactly, very, very strong ones. And I think Reagan was extremely good at keeping these diverse conservative elements together.
And he got lots of Democrats on his side, too.
Absolutely. But, I wouldn't just blame them. I mean, I think some of that kind of disconnect you see in the Obama administration, too. The Attorney General who, kind of attacks all kinds of policies that's kind of limited Americans' rights. The policies that he himself has promoted and enforced, from year after year. Where Obama, the same thing. These kind of bizarre speeches attacking themselves, essentially. Really, really puzzling and peculiar. And distressing.
Well, speaking of puzzling and peculiar, I have one last question for you, because it's something that you might know about in terms of city politics, and might be able to explain to me with firefighters and the cop unions. That you have the NYPD has achieved a kind of racial diversity that's kind of unbelievable in this era, but the firefighters have not. How have the firefighters? I read that the FDNY is something like 95% white. Why is that? How does that work?
Well, I'm not a great expert on this, and of course, there's been very, very, very extended federal litigation about this. And actually, the judge, Nicholas Garifas, who came out with this big decision that really finally forced New York City to take seriously the problem of integrating, went to high school with me. We were part of it, so we produced some important figures. Of course, for a lot of it was the test and how the test. They're both physical tests. You have to show certain physical capacities as well as written tests. And, I think the argument that's made by the opponents of these that these were not actually linked to the required job skills I'm in no position to judge any of this, but certainly in terms of keeping it all male, that was a big factor. And the particular, testing has often been shown to be racially preferential. So that's some piece of it.
And the police have a different interest in maintaining racial diversity also because of the different kind of job that they do.
I think that's true, and I think the firemen in New York were an extreme example of a kind of a group of people who have jobs which are extraordinarily dangerous that depend upon their trust and willingness to do anything for one another, building that on a kind of guild-like approach or a brotherhood which overlaps with a kind of racial and gender identity. And, you know, I mean, that's a pattern that you see a lot of places, you know, and a lot of places been eliminated, and a lot of fire departments in the United States has been gone.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, New York's been extraordinarily resistant to that changing. And, you know, I mean, what these guys and some women now do is just extraordinary. I mean, you know, having been in the fire and been rescued by a fireman for the rest of your life, you are unbelievably grateful to these people.
Well, sure,
But nonetheless, it's pretty shocking that, you know, this has remained the case. So much to the case, you know, after the horrible 9/11 attacks, when there was a proposed statue in memorial for the fallen firemen. You know, they had this statue they're going to have, you know, I think it was 3 firemen, and there was like each of a different racial or ethnic background, you know. And it was so unrepresentative of the actual people who died that they finally had to back it down, but, you know, because they couldn't actually show the truth of who died, you know, because, you know, and these were, don't get me wrong, these were wonderful and brave human beings, you know, but the demographic profile of it exposed, you know, the incredible unrepresentativeness of the fire department. I think actually, finally, that's on the road to changing. I think we sure will be pleased with that.
I hope so. I mean, that kind of city politics and that kind of cultural stuff and an intersection of labor seems like the kind of stuff that that you've spent your life talking about. And I just wanted to thank you for sitting down with me today, Professor Josh Freeman. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. It's a lot of fun.